We would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to the elders and their descendants who continue in a long tradition of cultural and spiritual connections to country since time immemorial. We acknowledge the First Peoples and their continuing custodianship of the lands on which we work and live. We recognise their struggle and honour their contributions to current and future generations. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
There was time in my 20s, in my 30s, where I was really, really dysregulated and had some really dysfunctional behaviours, both internally, and they were also projected out into the world. It affected my well-being, affected my health, and it certainly affected my relationships.
Welcome to the Reconnection Revolution. I'm your host, Celeste Halliday. In a world that often encourages us to play safe and stay small, we go deep and explore the big questions, the daily joys and chaos of life, and everything in between. Our goal? To help you find your spark if you feel like it's been dimmed, and ignite you if you're ready to create a reconnection revolution in your own life. Wherever you're at right now, I'm so glad that you're here with us. I'm really excited about today's episode with Mikey Ellis. If you've ever wondered what really goes on in the heads of the men in your life, be they partners, children, brothers, co-workers, I'm the mother of two boys and I have a partner, and I found today's conversation incredibly revealing and also really gave me hope about some of the stuff that gets really sticky in our relationships. So I really encourage you to listen to today's episode to find out more about what's going on in the heads of men and how can we help and what do we need to know. And I learned some really interesting things about shame that I'm definitely going to be talking about over the dinner table tonight. Hello, joining us today we have Mikey Ellis, who is a facilitator, coach and mentor, and specifically an expert, or focuses in. He hates that. Let's start again.
No, go for that.
You totally flinched with the expert.
No, but that's good because I'll address that.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
You don't want to, because I'm the same. I don't like it either.
Yep.
Today, we want to have a conversation, obviously, about reconnection and connection, but specifically, we want to explore the dynamic between men and women and to talk about some of the differences and also some of the similarities. And we might even get into some of the structural issues in our world that don't help either men or women be connected with themselves and with each other.
Yeah.
So to kick off, my question that I always like to learn more about is, what lights you up?
This lights me up, having conversations about things that are really important.
Yeah.
Things that I find that matter to me, that matter to others, and just being in connection. That's what really lights me up. The opportunity to have this conversation with you is really exciting.
It's great.
Yeah, thanks for having
me. I'm very excited about it too. And in terms of your journey, because I've been following you behind the scenes for some time, and your work's really evolved and now specialised. What in your life and your work kind of took you there and has brought you to the place you are now?
Yeah, I've been reflecting on that recently. I kind of go through these phases and stages, and it's like cycles that repeat.
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to doing what it is that I'm doing now, which is working with boys and men around understanding themselves and their roles and their identity better. And that really started for me when I was a teenager. I think like most teenagers, sort of struggling to find my place, amongst school and amongst family, amongst, society. And that sort of led to me studying philosophy and psychology at university and then becoming a teacher. Throughout my entire life, it's just been this constant trying to figure things out, trying to figure myself out. And it's led me to being a teacher. I was a teacher for 10 years, and I worked as an expedition guide, taking students overseas on expeditions to developing countries. And more recently, for the last 10 years, I've been working in organizations in various roles, but mostly around people and culture, and looking at, how we can bring out the best in ourselves and each other in workplaces. But it keeps coming back to working with men. That's born out of a need of mine to connect with other men and learn more about myself in that community. And it seems that there's others who are really keen to do that work as well. So I keep coming back to that. I always have. Throughout the whole time I was teaching and working in corporate, there was always coaching on the side where I'd be working with men, or I'd be working with adolescent boys who were just looking for some guidance. I think from my experience, both as a teacher and studying a lot around, psychology and developmental psychology, it's afforded me the opportunity to provide some perspective. And that's the thing I love to do most, is work with men in that context.
Were there specific things in your life that have kind of pointed you back there, or is there a bigger purpose? Not that it's not already a big purpose, but is there a point that you're going for?
It's less about an outcome for me and more about just learning to regulate these different parts of myself. Yeah. And I there was time in my 20s, in my 30s, where I was really, really dysregulated and had some really dysfunctional behaviors, both internally and they were also projected out into the world. It affected my well-being, affected my health, and it certainly affected my relationships. Just a desire to understand that and to do better, and be better. Not in the typical sense of achievement, but more in the sense of just feeling more grounded and more connected with myself. That's really what's driven me, because I've found that no matter what kind of success or experiences I have in the world, if I'm not happy within myself, then it's quite a shallow sense of achievement. And I just desire more from my life and more from my relationships and more from what I have, more that I feel like I can contribute than just those, typical measures of success. And so that kind of inquiry has just been really, really fascinating for me. That's kind of what's driven me. And as far as goals go, it's just to become more whole, more integrated, because I feel like I then have more to offer. I can show up and be of service or of value to others when I'm not a liability. A lot of it's just been like, let me just figure my stuff out. Can I swear on this podcast?
I'd love you to.
Knock just figure my shit out before it becomes anyone else's problem.
Yeah.
That's really what's driven me, to be honest.
Yeah, like I love the whole idea of integration, and I talk about it a lot in my work as well, because I think often people have these ideas of in this role, I'm supposed to be this, and in that role, I'm supposed to be that. I used to joke with some of my female clients that it's a bit like, which Barbie am I today? Like, I'm work Barbie or I'm mum Barbie, and it's just this exhausting kind of switching between ideas of who we should be, as opposed to being really comfortable and knowing who we are and bringing that to everything. And I think the world encourages us to kind of put these personas on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some ways, I mean, we know that it happens to women all the time, but in some ways we're not talking about the fact of how much it happens to men. This idea of like, what does good look like for a man now? I don't know. I think it's more clearly defined for women in some ways than it is for men, to really know if I'm going after being a good man, what is that? And who can I look to see that?
Such great questions.
Yeah.
And I think like the best questions don't necessarily have a definitive answer, but they invite even more inquiry and further questions. And so that's always been a question I've asked. What does it mean to be a good man? And a lot of my work personally over the last Well, since I guess the last sort of 5 to 10 years has been undoing expectations or assumptions, beliefs, conditioning that I have. That's both inherited, but also that I've cultivated myself. And just undoing that and starting to question, well, is that true? Is that helpful? And is that, the kind of, and am I becoming the kind of man that I want to be? And so I think you raised the point about, what to role models or examples of what good looks like. And I think for me, as a man, there's so many examples of what dysfunctional masculinity looks like. We're all very well aware of the impact of that, the outcome of that, the devastating impact on individuals, on families, on partners, on community. And there's a lot of attention, rightly so, drawn to that. And I think that's really important to highlight that. What's also as important is identifying what's an alternative to that, and how do we cultivate a more wholesome, healthy masculinity and culture of what it means to be a man. And I think it's not singular, and I think that's the whole point. I've grown up in a culture that has a pretty narrow view of what a man is and what it is to be successful as a man. In patriarchy, it's a very hierarchical model, and you're the best or you're not, and you're trying to become that, and whilst you're trying to become that, you're very much in competition with others, and it just doesn't work for me, and I think it clearly doesn't really work for anyone else as well. So I'm curious about alternative models and what we can build instead, and really working towards doing that. And I certainly don't have the answers. But I and I think anyone who says they do, I'm a bit wary of that as well. I think it's something that we become, and it is a process of becoming, and culture is, the sum of all its parts. It's not one model or one person. And so I feel like the impact or the influence that I can have starts with what I do and how I do it, and taking full responsibility for that. And then if that aligns with others, then that might be some work we can do together.
I'd love to come back to the P word. I've got two of them, patriarchy and power. Every time I say them, people flinch. They don't, and if I talk about capitalism, I'm in all sorts of trouble. But there's a visceral, physical flinch from people when we talk about the words, and I don't know if it's just that there's so much built up around them that we're not even really willing to discuss them. So I'd love to talk about that. What is the patriarchy? How do you see it playing out? And why do people roll their eyes when I say the patriarchy?
Well, I can only speak from my experience, and I think a lot of that has been, like, my experience has been misunderstanding and not really understanding what patriarchy is, and the impact that it has on everybody.
Which is the key point I think most people miss.
Yeah.
I think as soon as I say patriarchy, people think I'm man-hating, and it affects men as well as women.
It's a system. It's a system of, society and culture that affects everybody.
Yeah.
It benefits men, absolutely, at the expense of women, with that power differential, and it also impacts men negatively as well, because we're pitted against each other, and it doesn't afford or really allow for men who don't align and fit that dominant patriarchal hypermasculine archetype. If that's not you, then you've either got to work to become that, or there's, or again, you're a victim of that patriarchy, and there's something wrong with you. It's something I'm still learning about, because I have, being a white middle class man, I'm the beneficiary of a lot of the power that comes with living in a patriarchy, and so I've been blind to it. It's not something I've really had to rally against until I learn about it, and that's a responsibility I have, I think, of all men, to understand the system within which they live and benefit from, and to take some responsibility for both deconstructing and constructing something that is a system that's far more equitable. And I think that begins within ourselves, and looking at how I have shamed various parts of myself that don't fit within a patriarchal model.
I was thinking, it's just making me laugh before. I was thinking, I've got two boys, and they are just a delight to me. And watching them grow up in the world with the structures that exist, even living with me, where it's a running joke that at the dinner table, I'm either talking about the patriarchy or capitalism or connection, which is probably exhausting for everyone, frankly. But they're quite conversant, but in a way that kids are conversant. And one of my children, who does know exactly which buttons to push with me, has started saying to me, just whenever he wants to get a rise, yeah, it's because I'm an alpha male. Right. Right.
He's playing with fire.
And it's so funny because he's laughing and totally playing the game with me, playing with me. But also I can see that there's just a little bit in him that is still taking the positive ideal of what that is. And I keep talking to him and saying, what does it mean? What, you know, and he's like, I'm only joking. Like, you are, but also you're not. Like, somebody has said that to you. You're still seeing it as a frame. And he immediately moves into Andrew Tate. This is a kid who has no social media access, but is fully conversant in people who are being held up in certain, particularly teenage boy populations, right? So it's like you can protect and you can educate, and you hope that that's going to give them the skills and trust in them enough to kind of steer a different path. And yet it's still there. It's still living and breathing even in our little kids.
But the fact that you're having that conversation with your son is amazing. I was talking to a really good friend last night who has a 13-year-old son, and she took her son and a couple of his mates to go and see the Barbie movie.
Oh, yes.
And they loved it.
Yes.
And at the end in the car on the way home, one of them asked, what's patriarchy? Got these 12 and 13-year-old boys who are asking what patriarchy is. I didn't know what that word meant. I don't know if I even heard it when I was a teenager.
That age, yeah.
You know, we can't really change something we don't understand.
No, that's right.
And so, you know, having these conversations early I think it's great. It's a really important step, at least.
Yeah, there was a lot of interesting conversation with my boys and their peers. So one's 11 and one's 13, and the difference in what they were thinking about the Barbie movie and how they felt about it, particularly how they felt about Ken and Knuff.
Yep.
And they've all become kind of memes in our family now, some of these things. But I was really interested because my eldest boy really, he got the whole paradigm. He understood what was happening and why it was happening. And we had a man in the audience who was an older man who very vocally said, you know, this is just a load of rubbish. Can't believe I'm having to sit here and watch this, while he was sitting with 6 women, by the way. And I was like, wow, that's a really brave move. Cinema full of people who are watching, you know, the opposite. It's just so interesting that, like, for the younger ones coming through, and are you working with younger boys still as well as older men?
Yep. I work with boys from 12 years up.
Yeah, right. And so how are you seeing that play out? Because there's a whole, you know, like, boys, everyone, teenagers, but boys really do their peers start to become so much more important to them than parental ideas and stuff. And then they're looking for rites of passage that don't exist in our world, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, look, there's so much to say about this. You mentioned rites of passage. And you also mentioned that, you know, what happens, you know, during that sort of pre-adolescent and early adolescent stage is boys tend to look to others, and they learn by observation, and they see what others are doing, and particularly older boys and older men. They then become really influenced and easily influenced by you know, who they're seeing. And it is a significant milestone in development, and in that identity development as well, that isn't really supported by a conscious and intentionally facilitated rite of passage, which I think is really important and really necessary to who we're becoming, to help kids identify those parts of themselves that they really want to cultivate, to help them identify those parts of themselves that are really craving some validation, or that are looking to defend themselves, or to big up themselves, to make themselves feel better. Like, these, we have to teach kids how to manage what's going on in their bodies and in their emotional, nervous system. Awareness and regulation is fundamental to becoming a human that is both self-aware and responsible for their impact and their behaviors. And because that doesn't happen as much as it needs to, you can see what happens to teenagers, you know, an impact that they have on themselves, on each other, and that lack of guidance and lack of awareness and support in becoming is compounded as we grow. We grow older. We might not grow more whole
Yeah.
as a human. We get to middle age and we're like, well, what am I doing?
Yeah.
How have I become? And I don't feel equipped or capable to deal with whatever challenges are coming my way. And then, we can see the impact of what that of that, whether it's self-inflicted harm or projected harm onto others. And I think it really starts very early, and those rites of passage are incredibly important.
Yeah, and
lacking.
How are we not teaching the brain-body connection? I think people are just starting to learn about nervous system regulation and emotional management. If you boil everything down, those two things, more than anything, have the biggest impact on our ability to function effectively and actually have the space to be able to choose how we want to respond, not just be in a constant state of reactivity. And part of what fascinates me about it, one is that we're so disconnected. I keep talking about, I can't remember whose idea it was, but that they said something like we think we're just brains walking around in separate skulls, like skeletons walking around. And there's no sense of the collective anymore. And so I'm talking all about individuals working to connect with themselves and the world, but we are so individualistic now that we think we really are on our own. And we don't realize that we're catching this stuff and spreading this stuff to each other. Stress literally permeates out of our sweat and around us, and we catch cortisol from each other, literally get stress, anxiety. I mean, all mood and culture is catchy, and we keep thinking just that one person is wrong and that one behavior is wrong, never looking at the collective and the system and how we're just spreading this stuff continuously between us.
Yep. Yep. In terms of emotional and nervous system regulation.
Yeah.
And just the awareness of the brain-body connection, there wasn't as much awareness, general awareness of this 30-something years ago when
there was none of it in my house.
When I was at school. So my parents did a really great job, given the circumstances and conditioning within which they grew up as kids post World War II. And you've got, they had parents who were either lived through wars and either fought in wars or were very much trying to survive during this incredible existential threat of a world war. And that was how they grew up. My parents grew up without a lot of awareness around personal development or psychological stages of identity development or parenting.
Yeah, who knew?
And so they did the best they could with what they had, both in terms of their experience and their conditioning and their access to knowledge or information or support. And I think they did a pretty good job, all things considered. The teachers that I had growing up in school, they did the best they could from what they learnt in teachers' college. But now we have access to so much more information. And we have a generation who are Gen X who are going, I don't want my kids to grow up like I did. I want them to feel a greater sense of, belonging and connection and resilience and resourcefulness, and I have to teach them that. So I've had to learn to do that myself in order to model that. So, that's the culture in which we're brought up in, and I think that we have to honor that as we grow and evolve as well, to prioritize that, because if we don't, no one's coming to save us.
No one's coming to save us. I think I have a bangle that says no one's coming to save me.
And no one's coming to save me. That doesn't mean that I'm all alone in the world.
No.
It means that I have both agency and responsibility and the opportunity to do that. That means I'm not somebody else's problem to solve. I'm not a burden on anybody else, and I'm not needing anybody else to save me. And I think if more people, if more men who are privileged through a culture of patriarchy can do that, then we're going to take the burden of responsibility for doing that of others who have been doing that for far too long, and will enable everybody just to get on with doing what they need to do.
I think Mike is a great example of somebody who's really doing the work, as so many of us would call it, who is open to understanding the role that he plays in the world, and making the world a better place through being better himself. And I love that he talked about self-regulation in terms of how we manage our emotions, and particularly really getting to be aware of our nervous system and how our nervous system pushes us to respond in ways that we probably wouldn't choose to if we weren't being so reactive and going into kind of fight or flight mode. So I think we get overwhelmed by these big concepts of power and patriarchy, and we don't want to think that we're being controlled by something bigger than us. We want to feel like we've got agency. And just thinking about that, our emotional management, choosing our thoughts and the way that we feel, really tuning in to our nervous system and how reactive we're feeling so that we can choose the way that we want to respond instead of just being constantly reactive with the people around us. We can kind of choose to be that better version of ourselves that all of us really want to be. And I think it means that we can stop being so pedantic when we're interacting with other people, waiting for them to react in ways that we don't like or don't want to see. We can give them a chance so that we can actually hear them and shift our attention out from that constant dialogue we've all got in our own heads to the other person that we're with so that we can learn and have real conversations and maybe even actual debate. And I think that's how we change things. The little things we do with ourselves ripple out around us, and I think they are the things that can help us make actual system change. If you loved today's episode as much as I did, guess what? There's more. We could not cut the conversation off. Mikey and I just kept talking, and there is a part 2 for your listening pleasure if you want to find out